climate change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Climate change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome to day 2 of our European Humanitarian Forum, and welcome, of course, to this particular session dedicated to education. And we will see together how we can step up the international engagement. Some of you are joining us here in person, and it's a pleasure to actually see people, but many of you are joining us virtually, online, and we also will have some speakers joining us online. So I would like to invite you joining us online to switch on your cameras, because it's much nicer to see faces between yourselves. We don't see you, but you see each other, and it's nicer than blank screens. We also will have this session recorded. It will be made available on the website of the European Humanitarian Forum after the event. We have interpretation in French and English, so don't hesitate to choose the language you feel most comfortable with. And in addition to our panel, sorry, I'm just interrupting myself for a second. Sorry. On top of our panel, we have a list of predetermined interventions immediately after our panels. And you are also welcome to send some questions and comments via Slido. We will hopefully have some time at the end of the session to take a couple of questions, either from the floor or online, but we will do our best. We cannot guarantee. We have a very strict timetable with a lot of sessions today, so please bear with us. We'll do our best. If you would like to tweet about this particular event, remember it's hashtag European Humanitarian Forum, all in one word. And if you want to join us on Slido, it's hashtag EHF-RU for Room U, which is where we are physically located in this beautiful building. But let's get back to our topic. Education has been facing many challenges lately, of course due to the COVID pandemic, but also to structural underinvestment and numerous attacks on schools, most lately in Ukraine. In this session, we will, as I said, see how we can step up our joint engagement on education. Education is a fundamental right and need for children all over the world. It's a basic need, and particularly for children who are caught up in emergencies or in fragile contexts. Education is the basis for hope, for normality, for peace, for resilience. It's also what builds our future. And yet, Education is one of the most underfunded areas of humanitarian aid. Only around 3% of aid is allocated to education. And despite the UN SDGs, and SDG 4 to ensure quality of education, there are still some 260 million children around the world who do not go to either primary or secondary school. In our session, we will look into these challenges, but also into the possible innovative solutions that we can bring to provide a coordinated long-term vision to education. We will also see how we can ensure, as much as possible, effective investment in education in emergencies, and how we can build on the lessons learned from COVID, especially when it comes to the role of technologies. To kick off our discussions, I invite 3 young leaders whose education was disrupted by war, displacement, and crisis. Their testimonies were recorded for 2 of them, and the third one will be online with us. And I invite you to listen to them very carefully. So our first recorded testimony is from Anojita Sivaskaran from Sri Lanka. She's a youth and peace advocate supported by World Vision.
Hello everyone. I'm thankful to the European Union and the organizing team for having me as one of our speakers today. I'm Anojita, a youth activist from Sri Lanka. I'm serving as a member of Refugee Education Council. As someone from the northern part of Sri Lanka, I have directly experienced the last phase of Sri Lankan civil war, and we as a family have faced many challenges, including getting access to food, education, water, industries, safe engagement, and many other basic needs. When I started schooling after war, I observed many differences between my friends and myself. Because in school and in universities, I was lacking in many things, including speaking English fluently, in academic records, and in life facilities. We even lost our house due to war. Dear global leaders, it's a call to immediate action from a young girl who really wants to live her remaining life peacefully with her friends. We need more and more programs and funding at all levels targeted to meet the needs of the most disadvantaged children, adults, and youth. Countries must ensure that adequate percentage of their national budgets are spent on education. We need to guarantee adequate mental health support is given to the children, youth, and adults who are affected by traumas and other mental health issues. We, as young people, need more spaces, not only to participate and come and talk about our stories and our experiences, but also to meaningfully engage in decision-making, advocacy, and policy design, because we are here with lived experiences. We are here to commit ourselves. We are here to volunteer. If we can do this together, I'm sure that one day, not only one Anojita, but more Anojitas, more young leaders can make this world more beautiful and peaceful. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Anojita. Our second young leader is Fatima from Syria, and she's also supported by World Vision.
مرحبا، أريد بدء خطابي بشكر الاتحاد الأوروبي وكل من ساهم وشارك في وجوده هنا اليوم. أنا اسمي فاطمة تيسير علي، عمري 17 عام، ولدت في مدينة تدمير التاريخية، أعيش مع والدتي وأبي وأخوتي ال7. بدأت الحرب في وطني عام 2011. كنت آنذاك 6 أعوام، ولكن عندما تصاعدت الحرب اضطر والدي لأخذي أنا ووالدتي وأخوتي الآخرين، وتخلينا عن منزلنا المعرض لرشق القنابل، وبذلك بدأت رحلة النزوح المليئة بالصعاب في الصحراء. وصلنا أخيرا للحدود الأردنية السورية، وذهب أخي إلى تركيا بهدف العمل في مجال الحلويات. ولم يستطع إكمال تعليمه بسبب أسباب مالية بالرغم من كونه من الطلاب المميزين. جلسنا مع والدي على الحدود الأردنية السورية وكانت الحياة مليئة بالصعاب وفرص إكمال التعليم كانت معدومة، وبعد ذلك استطعنا دخول المملكة الأردنية كلاجئين واستقرينا في مخيم الأزرق للاجئين كعائلة. أكملت تعليمي في مدارس الأردنية الحكومية في مخيم الأزرق للاجئين، ولكن توقف تعليمي بسبب جائحة كورونا وتحول التعليم عن بعد، وأنا ممتنة جدا للحكومة الأردنية لإتاحتها حلول من خلال منصة درسك التي توفر دروس إلكترونية للطلاب في أنحاء المملكة، ويتم تعليم الطلاب وفقا للمنهاج الأردني الرسمي. وأنا حاليا في الصف الأول ثانوي الفرع الأدبي، وأتمنى دراسة الصحافة والإعلام من أجل نقل الحقائق لكل من يتابع، وألتمس من أصحاب المصلحة في الاتحاد الأوروبي لدعم الطلاب مثلي وأخوتي عند التقديم إلى منح دراسية بغاية إكمال مسيرتنا الدراسية، وأطلب منهم السماح لي ولعائلتي وللسوريين النازحين الهجرة إلى الاتحاد الأوروبي أملا بتحقيق حياة وتعليم أفضل، وجميع المتطلبات الأساسية متاحة بدءا من التعليم الأساسي إلى الثانوي، ولكن تكمن المشكلة في عدم إتاحة منح دراسية برغم من وجود تحصيلات دراسية عالية ودعم مالي. يستطيع الاتحاد الأوروبي دعم تعليمنا من خلال: 1. دعم التعليم عن بعد من خلال تقوية البنية التحتية للإنترنت في المخيم، حيث الإنترنت ضعيف جدا في المخيم ويمثل نقطة تحدي للطلاب، وأعاني أنا وأخواتي من العلم أنه لدي شقيقين توأم ولد وبنت في الصف السابع. 2. توزيع ألواح إلكترونية متقدمة من أجل مساعدة الطلاب في الدراسة عن بعد. 3. دعم المشروع وتمويله ماديا بهدف إرجاع الطلاب الذين تركوا المدارس بسبب الأوضاع الاقتصادية الصعبة في المخيم وأرغموا على العمل لدعم عوائلهم ماديا. 4. دعم روح الأمية للكبار ماديا. 5. توفير حوافز مادية خصوصا للإناث فوق 18 عام من أجل متابعة التعليم ومحاولة الزواج المبكر. مرة أخرى أريد التعبير عن امتناني للأشخاص الذين هم جزء من الاتحاد الأوروبي وأصحاب العلاقة على بنائهم وتطويرهم وحس المسؤولية نحو المجتمع الذي أعيش فيه.
Our third speaker, our third young leader, is joining us live from Kenya. Magartu, are you with us? Magartu? Do we have a... Yes, we do have a connection. Good morning, Magartu. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Can you hear us? Magartu? We can see you. Magartu? Can you hear us? I'm afraid. Magartu? I'm afraid she cannot hear us. Turning to our tech team, do you know if the issue is on our side or on the Kenya side? Magartu, hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, we hear you. Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you.
Magartu, we'd love to hear your testimony.
Okay.
Would you like to share it with us?
Yes.
Go ahead, we're listening.
Like, there are sometimes, like, when you're disabled, like, especially me, what used to happen, like, sometimes when you greet people and some people just like say, how are you? And say, fine. And like you want to shake hands, like what we used to do in Africa mostly before the coming of Corona. Like when you want to shake hands, the person has already gone. And because you cannot see, just do like this. And like that is how sometimes I do. happens like to me when you're a blind person. Somehow difficult because in school we do share ideas and discuss about and study. Like when you're at home, you're just alone. So it was somehow difficult.
Magartu, I understand you have written a poem that you wanted to share with us.
Yes.
Please do.
Okay. I'm excited.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. The poem is titled All I Need. Ever wonder why you are the one who was chosen to care for me? It may not be obvious sometimes, but you have all I need. I need someone with patience. I need someone who is kind. I need someone who is strong, not quick to lose their mind. I need someone who is special, someone very special indeed. I need someone who will care, someone to care for me. You may never know my thoughts, you may never know my voice. Just please, be reassured, that is not my choice. God knew what He was doing when He gave me to you. He knew you could handle me. He knew what you could do. You see, I'm very special. Someone very special indeed. I know that I'm not perfect. Things I need and can't get make you cry. I'm very aware that you try. You try your hardest. I'm your little girl, and I know that you love me for me. One day you'll get me what I need. We will know your greatest intent. But for now, I am just me. No matter how hard that may be, but I am a special person, someone very special indeed. You will never know how glad I am that God gave you to me. You see, both are the lucky ones. The lucky one is me. I have you to take care of me, and you are lucky to have me. Thank you.
Magartu, I don't know if you could hear the applause here in the room. Did you hear? Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much for sharing this with us. It was a very moving moment. Thank you, Magartu. Take care and bye-bye.
Bye.
So now we'll turn to our panelists, and I will, of course, invite all of you to comment on the three testimonies we have just heard in your introductions or in your presentations. But just to set the scene, we know that education has become absolutely central to the EU's external effort. 10% of ECHO's humanitarian aid budget is dedicated to education in emergencies, and it is now combined with a 10% investment in education from the EU's development instruments in order to build resilience, equity, and inclusiveness for education systems. Addressing education in emergencies means that we must combine immediate action with lasting solution, because it is a long-term project. And to help us set the scene in a broader manner, it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Augusto Santos Silva, who's the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of Portugal. Mr. Minister, good morning.
Good morning. So, if I may, I I think that the first thing we need is to be aware of the dimension of this problem. Take the Ukrainian case. In less than 1 month, already 15,000 of Ukrainians have arrived to my country, to Portugal. 1/3 are minors. They are entitled to the right to the education. Already 500 of them are already enrolled in Portuguese basic primary and secondary schools, which is a fantastic result in less than 1 month. But we have to scale it up, because 500 of young people enrolled in school is not enough to fulfill the right of education of these thousands and thousands of Ukrainians arriving to our countries. So how can we do this? At the national level, it is only possible if we mobilize all our resources. The resources of the Ministry of Education, of course, but also of the municipalities, of the local communities, of schools. We need the effort of all civil society to get a response, a rapid response to the needs of these people, because we have to provide them with a basic knowledge of Portuguese language. It's not that close to Ukrainian. And of course, you have to provide them with the resources for their integration. Another example, in 2013, our former President Jorge Sampaio launched what he called the initiative, the Global Platform for Syrian Students. In that case, there was a specific target, young people that the civil war in Syria impeded to proceed with their graduation. And then the effort was to grant them scholarships to fulfill their studies and to complete their graduation and post-graduation in Portuguese universities. In that case, the idea was to not only to respond to the current needs of these people, but also mainly to prepare the post-war reconstruction of Syria. So at the national level, you need to mobilize all your political and social resources. You need money, but money is not the critical variable. The critical variable is people. People from schools, from the boards of schools, from local communities, from universities, from municipalities, and so on. At the European and international level, I think we need coordination, because I was speaking of 15,000 Ukrainian people arrived to Portugal, but if you think of Poland, you think of 1 million, more than 1 million of Ukrainians. We expect 8, 9, 10 million of Ukrainian refugees. So we have to coordinate ourselves at European level in order to provide to all these people, many of them are minors, the response they need. That's why Portugal has launched in the United Nations platforms, UNESCO, United Nations properly, and so on, what we called, what our former President Sampaio called, a rapid response mechanism for higher education in emergencies. So we need this kind of political coordination at international level. Of course, the Commission will be essential for us, the Europeans, but we need to go beyond Europe and mobilize also other partners. So I think we need this two-track approach at the national level and the international level. But mostly we need to be aware of the dimension of this. Again, I think 500 young people coming from Ukraine in less than 1 month already enrolled in schools of Portugal, a country they don't know, is a fantastic result, but it's a very small drop in an ocean.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this is how we really translate the political commitment into action.
Yes, yes, indeed, because we have, of course, we have the humanitarian approach is very important as a first response to emergencies, but then the key is to provide integration for these people. Even if they are in our countries on a temporary basis because they want to return to their countries. But this is a medium-term horizon. So it's not only, of course, we need to feed them, but again, education is a fundamental right, and education is the ground on which you can build up other rights and the reconstruction of a society.
And just one final point, but in terms of coordination, as you said, we need to coordinate and at European level, particularly between the member states. The Commission has an essential role to play. How do you see that happening? I mean, there's a lot of work done by DG ECHO, obviously, but...
Yes, as you have already mentioned, I think there was a quantum leap when the Commission decided to allocate 10% of the total budget for humanitarian aid to education. So it is important, but mostly we need to build up networks at European level between our universities, between our vocational schools, between our secondary schools. This is the kind of institutions, the kind of resources, of assets that we need. I don't think that money is the critical variable. Of course, money is necessary, of course, fundamental, but as a means. First, we have to answer this question. What are we doing for what purpose? Again, we are doing this because if we are hosting, for instance, in the Ukrainian case, mothers with their minor children, or in the Syrian and Afghan case, you are receiving, for instance, young women that were studying in their countries, and the change in their countries impedes them to proceed with their higher education. So in that case, you need to launch specific responses to those groups. If not, deception will be the rule. If not, your approach is the conventional approach of having refugee camps with basic needs to fulfilled. This is not the European response. So we need to address these different groups with different and specific responses.
Thank you very much, Minister Santos Silva. We have another important message to listen to. It's a pre-recorded message from Gordon Brown, the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So let's listen to Gordon Brown.
Dear partners and colleagues and friends, it's a pleasure to be with you and say a few words ahead of this important panel discussion about the need we now have to step up support for education in emergencies and in protracted crises. As we all know, education is the foundation upon which we build our future. It's not just an investment in development, growth, innovation and prosperity, it's an investment in humanity itself. It unlocks all our development goals: gender equality, employment, better health, a higher quality of life. But we cannot achieve universal education for primary and secondary pupils as we have promised by 2030 unless we include all the most vulnerable and most marginalised and make it possible for them to complete pre-primary, primary and secondary education, giving them a fair shot at realising the full potential. And so we must urgently step up our investments, in particular in emergencies and protracted crisis, and do much more to reach those left furthest behind. Now, despite our best efforts, with the creation of education cannot wait, that I'm privileged to chair, and despite some of the great progress we've made over the years, millions of children around the world are still being deprived of that basic opportunity to achieve an education because they're caught up in war, violence, conflict or disaster. Sadly, the situation is getting worse, and it's getting worse very quickly. Our thoughts go out to Ukraine, where seeing a senseless conflict unfold on a devastating scale. Home schools, orphanages and hospitals have come under attack, and 2.5 million people at the latest count have fled to neighbouring countries. The war has, however, impacted upon the entire school-age population, 5.7 million girls and boys. And although support is underway, the learning loss is expected to be significant. And let us also not forget Afghanistan, where malnutrition rates have been skyrocketing, and half of the population is now facing acute hunger. While the United Nations and its partners are struggling to raise the funds needed to pull the country back from the brink, with stocks still high for the pledging conference on March the 31st, we know the Afghan education system remains on the verge of collapse. And even before the Taliban takeover last year, 4 million children were out of school. Now 10 million who are enrolled are at risk of dropping out as well. The numbers, as you can see, are staggering. According to UNHCR, more than 1% of the world's population is now forcibly displaced. Well over 80 million people, a country the size of Germany. That is a 42% increase compared to 2010. And as the situation not only in Ukraine and Afghanistan, but I could also mention Ethiopia, Sudan, Venezuela, Yemen, and all across the Sahel continues to deteriorate, it is likely that the numbers of people uprooted by war, violence, conflict and disaster will increase even further in the coming years. So we are, colleagues and friends, at a critical juncture. We are faced with an unprecedented global challenge, and we must rise to the occasion. It's our collective duty to step up and literally change the course of humanity by helping change the lives of every single child in every crisis. In order to do so, we need to urgently mobilise at least $5 billion to ensure that an additional 20 million children and adolescents affected by conflict or climate change gain access to the inclusive and equitable quality education we have promised them. Education Cannot Wait, which is the UN Global Fund for Education in Emergencies and Protracted Crises, is an excellent mechanism through which public and private sector donors can channel their support for education of children in these catastrophic situations. And for those nearly 130 million children and adolescents left furthest behind, we need to make available all the resources necessary to provide them with what should be a quality education. We need to ensure a whole-of-child approach, advancing the learning while also improving the protection and safeguarding and overall well-being. In particular, we need to break down the long-standing barriers to education for the 65 million girls, including by providing access and sustainably increasing the number of female teachers, as well as other education personnel. Governments, including the European Union, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and private sector donors, we all need to come together and rise to the challenge. We need to move away from the one-off contributions that are generous but not enough, and make multi-year financial commitments. We need to do our utmost to bridge the humanitarian development divide and further strengthen the efficiency and effectiveness of the education responses we are supporting. Continuity is key. When the crisis is over and recovery takes place, we need to invest in long-term reforms and sustainable and transformative change, like the International Financing for Education Facility, IFED, which can provide guarantee-based financing, which would mean, for example, for 100 million of grants and 400 million of guarantees, we could provide nearly 2,000 million of additional finance funding education and offering a fantastic return on investment. It is needed more than ever today. Allow me to close by appealing to all of you to follow the example set by the European Commission a few years ago and prioritise education and humanitarian aid, both in sudden onset emergencies and in more protracted crisis settings, with no less than 10% of the international aid budget going to education. Let's commit ourselves to a 20th century in which we ensure that we are the first generation of which every child, especially every crisis-affected child, is able to go to school, instead of developing some of the potential of some of the children in some of the countries of the world. We can instead, and must instead, develop all of the potential of all children everywhere.
A very impassioned plea by Gordon Brown there, and I'm sure it has been heard. I would now like to turn to Margarita Focas-Licht, and Margarita is the acting deputy CEO of Global Partnership for Education. Good morning, Margarita. Margarita, how can we ensure sustainable and effective investment on education for all? And how can we deliver on SDG 4 that we mentioned before for children, particularly those who live in humanitarian emergencies and fragile environments? It must be on, don't worry.
It's okay, it's on. First of all, thank you for inviting me to join this important event. And I just want to start by mentioning the three really powerful testimonials from these young youth advocates. And they really point to both the challenges and the solutions. The challenges that children and youth face in conflict and fragile situations and crisis, the displacement and conflicts that can last for the duration of their schooling, lack of access to basic needs, massive loss in learning, and children dropping out of school. They also reflect some of the solutions that we need to focus our attention to, including the inclusion, as the Minister has also referenced, of displaced learners in national school systems, continuing education through online learning, as well as education's role in peace building. We need to ensure that these solutions are the rule and not the exceptions, and to support education systems to be prepared for crises so that education is not disrupted. So to respond to the question of how we can deliver on SDG 4 for crisis-affected children, I'd like to highlight 3 points on how to ensure sustainable and effective investment in education. First, we need sufficient financing of education in emergencies, as Gordon Brown has just strongly emphasized. Education cannot be an afterthought when crisis strikes, and we cannot deliver on SDG 4 if we lose children during a crisis due to dropout or not being able to access distance education. And we know that children overwhelmingly see education as their top priority in crisis. And we've heard this being underlined by these 3 testimonials we've heard earlier this morning. And we have seen progress in financing education in emergencies since the Global Humanitarian Summit, and especially through the establishment of Education Cannot Wait, which was set up, among other things, to really help position education as a priority in the humanitarian agenda. And now the EU is leading the way in its commitment to spend 10% of humanitarian aid on education. So we need to keep up this progress. And we know that humanitarian needs are only increasing as we face the multiple crises of COVID, of climate change, and of conflict across the world. Secondly, we need to invest in sustainable solutions for crisis-affected children so that each child has access to a full cycle of accredited education. And children's educational needs in protracted crises often last a very long time, sometimes the duration of their schooling. UNHCR estimates that nearly 16 million refugees, or 76%, were in a protracted situation by the end of 2020, meaning that they were in exile for at least 5 consecutive years in a given host country. So this means that our solutions have to be long-term, and with the aim of including crisis-affected children in national public education systems. We know that all children benefit when there's an investment in underserved communities of countries where the situation is the most difficult, both for host communities and refugee children. Global Partnership for Education supports partner countries in these efforts by strengthening gender-responsive planning, mobilizing coordinated action and financing to enable transformative change, and to strengthen capacity of partners. For example, in Djibouti and Ethiopia, we were able to leverage funding from other partners to help make schools more accessible for refugee children. And overall, GPE's approach is based on an understanding that any country can be hit by a crisis. And education systems everywhere need to be able to mitigate the impact of crisis and conflict in a way that does not undermine current and past investments in education. Building resilient education systems is critical for investments in education to be sustainable and effective. And resilience brings me to my 3rd point, which is that education has a vital role to play in peace building. It supports capacities of individuals to cope in times of crisis and provides a sense of normalcy while providing access to vital services such as psychosocial support to children. While education can be a force for peace and mutual understanding, unfortunately, it can also be a force to the contrary if the education system excludes groups of children from access to education. So to be effective, our investments need to be cognizant of the roots of vulnerability and the two-way interaction between education and conflict. And this is one reason why GPE pays such close attention to equity and the inclusion of the most marginalized groups of children in education services in our member countries, including girls who are disproportionately affected by crisis. So finally, I want to end by highlighting two prerequisites for success in delivering SDG 4 for children living in fragile contexts: coordination and agility. The three aspects of the humanitarian development peace nexus are simultaneously at play in any given context. And this means that the financing and expertise of many different partners is needed and that our efforts need to be coordinated. So to this end, GPE supports strengthening partner countries' coordination mechanisms, including during crises. This can include financial support to strengthen coordination between development and humanitarian mechanisms, as well as cross-sector coordination. And at the global level, we have joined with the World Bank and ECW to increase and coordinate financing to refugee education. Secondly, we should also strive to apply nexus thinking to the way education is funded. So too often, we're still thinking in terms of either humanitarian or development funding. Whereas what's needed is flexibility to adapt to the complexity of the situations that exist. And this is one reason why it has always been important for GPE to be adaptive to partner country needs, having mechanisms that allow quicker disbursement of funds in crisis situations, and being creative, like setting up the COVID financing window that provided $500 million to help countries respond to the COVID crisis. And since I'm speaking today to major funders of education, both the EU and member states, I encourage you to reflect within your own agencies on how education could be funded more seamlessly across the triple nexus. And this would help to achieve the outcomes that we all seek for children living in emergencies and fragile contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Our next speaker is joining us online. And I'm happy to welcome Inger Ashing, CEO of Save the Children. Inger?
Thank you
yes,
so much.
Good morning and welcome. Now, Inger, how can all the actors of humanitarian and development do more and do better to provide for safety, equity and quality of education, particularly, of course, in emergencies?
So thank you very much for that question, and thank you for a great event. So I think first I want to say that a child's right to safe, inclusive and quality education does not end in times of emergency. And we all know that, but I think it needs to be repeated, because in times of emergency, that is exactly what is happening. We are not ensuring that they are getting their right to education as they should be. And when I talk to children about what is important to them, education is at the top of the list. And we know that continuing education is what children and their parents want. When countries are overwhelmed by crisis and displacement, nearly 1/3 of children identified education as their top priority. And we heard this call so passionately from Anurjita, Fatima, and Margarita as well. Education is a fundamental right for every child, and it is vital for their development. It is an investment in our future, as we heard Gordon Brown say, because it also protects children from poverty, violence, exploitation, and abuse. But yet, the education of hundreds of millions of children worldwide continues to be disrupted from the triple threat of conflict, COVID-19, and the climate crisis. This triple threat resonates today more than ever. And as COVID-19 vaccine inequality persists, ongoing and new conflicts arise, and the climate crisis deserves our full mobilization to ensure that children's rights to education is upheld. The impact of the conflict on children in Ukraine is on all our minds, but we must not forget the impact of a protracted crisis on children's access to education in countries like Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan, and many, many more. And as we now know, the onset of COVID-19 has exacerbated many of the existing challenges that education system faced. And I think this is an important thing to remember, that even prior to the pandemic, in crisis-affected countries, almost 130 million children were out of school, almost half of the global out-of-school population. And whilst the pandemic has forced these issues into the light, education has long been in a state of emergency. And even before the pandemic, UNESCO's projections for SDG 4 were dire. They predict almost no progress on reducing the number of children who were out of school by 2030. And we have only 8 years to achieve the SDG. And the question is how we will respond to reduce the widening gaps between the rhetoric and the reality that we see on the ground. The situation is getting worse as we speak. I do believe that the European Humanitarian Forum offers a great opportunity to keep the momentum on education, and we need to keep education very high on our agendas. We need to continue to ask our leaders to invest in strong, resilient education systems. With the number of challenges and crises that we are facing, it is imperative that we do not build back the way that things were, but that we build forward better and differently. And if we are serious about meeting the SDGs and the right to the education set out in the Child Rights Convention, then we have to put education at the heart of our global recovery. Save the Children are working with education as one of our top priorities and have been doing so for a long, long time. And based on our experience, we have developed an 8-point plan to ensure that children can return to school safely and that they get their learning and well-being on track, but also to boost preparedness and anticipatory action. And we heard some great recommendations from our youth leaders, but I want to emphasize a few recommendations on what I think we can collectively do to practically accelerate action and to ensure that all children affected by crisis have access to safe, uninterrupted, good quality education that supports their resilience and overall development. Firstly, we need to strengthen coherence between planning and financing for development and humanitarian action. And we heard other speakers say this before. But this is critical, and it requires a shift to a multi-year programming cycle, as well as greater investment in preparedness matches with flexible funding that can allow education systems to respond to emerging crises. It is about coordination and agility, as we heard. But secondly, we also need to take an anticipatory approach through crisis-sensitive planning. And every Ministry of Education needs to be better prepared to respond to crisis, to ensure that learning can continue and children's rights to education are fulfilled. And we need the international community to support this. Today, we can predict with increasing confidence the occurrence and the potential impact of climate-related events, conflict, and diseases. This can help decision makers raise funds ahead of such shocks in order to minimize the impact on education. And by taking action before a crisis hits, ministries of education, governments, and donors, along with the humanitarian community, can better meet learning and well-being needs. Based on our experience, an anticipatory action framework has 3 elements: forecasting using real-time data, pre-agreed action plans, and pre-arranged finance. It should include both development and humanitarian organizations, children themselves, teachers, and their communities. And it's really positive to see the ongoing coordination between Education Cannot Wait and the Global Partnership for Education to funding the education sector and advocacy where it makes sense to do so. The ongoing coordinating helps minimize duplication, enhance value for money, and ensure programs are effectively implemented and monitored at national level. Thirdly, and my last point, we cannot underestimate the need for innovative approaches to non-formal education with mental health and psychosocial support in reaching out to school children. Integrating and strengthening mental health and psychosocial support as a core element of national education, protection, and health systems is essential to meet the continuum of care needs of all children before, during, and after crisis. And in recent years, we have seen great progress in recognizing that education is a crucial, life-saving part of any humanitarian response, including thanks to the critical support from the European Commission. We very much welcome, notably, the recent commitment by their international partnership to dedicate 10% of the development funding, in addition to the existing commitment by ECHO to dedicate 10% of funding for education in emergencies, to education to enable the responders to work across the continuum. This is an encouragement for all donors to have a similar approach. We still have to focus our efforts to deliver on our promise that education cannot wait. And I want to end with the following. Leaders must act now. It's simply not good enough to build back to how things were. We need to build forward and differently. A child's right to education does not end in an emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inger. Thank you for being with us. Indeed, the pandemic has been mentioned by several of our speakers as the cause for more vulnerability in terms of education. And at least 1/3 of the world's school children, that is 463 million children globally, were unable to access remote learning. So it was available, but they couldn't access it. And the setback in not accessing school is longer than just the time that they spend out of the classroom. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, for every year schools are closed, an estimated 2.8 years of education are lost. So that is really something that we need to reflect upon. And it is particularly concerning, of course, for girls and vulnerable groups for whom risks such as early marriage, child labor, or poverty will prevent them from ever returning to school. At the same time, the pandemic has also taught us the value of resilience and innovation. In humanitarian contexts, we have set up accelerated and catch-up education programs in order to bridge the education gap. There's also been alternative remote learning channels. So several initiatives have been put in place, very often digital-based solutions. And they're enough to help, but at the same time, they need to be supported by connectivity. They need to be supported by the right skills and the knowledge of the teacher in order to be really efficient. So I'd like now to focus on these innovative and adaptable solutions to help the recovery process. And for that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Yasmin Sherif, who's here in person with us, and she's the director of Education Cannot Wait.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is not on.
It is on, and you need to have it on. You need to speak in the mic because of the interpreters.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, I will respond to that question, but I'd like to go through a little bit more on Education Cannot Wait and introduce us what we're actually doing in crisis, and then look at COVID response, as you asked, and on the whole coordination architecture that has been touched upon. But I want to build on, first of all, I'm really glad, it's also saddening to see the testimony of our youth advocates from Sri Lanka and Syria, and the incredibly moving poem by Margarito. I felt like that was, and congrats to UNHCR, I saw your flag behind there, so she must have been a refugee. But that really moved us. I mean, I think if you all felt that, and how she needs us, but we need her as well. Because without her, we're going to forget our humanity. She reminded us of that one. So let me start overall, and I'll build on the chair of the high-level steering group, Gordon Brown, and his speech today. So Education Cannot Wait. We are a global fund for education in emergencies and protracted crisis. We were established at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. We became operational in 2017. And as Margarita, my colleague from GP, said, we were established especially for crisis, for situations where you have refugees, internally displaced, climate-induced disasters. Because there is a difference between delivering education in a country that is fairly stable, even if it's a low-income country, and a country that is in total chaos, or a country that suddenly receives an influx of refugees. I take Uganda, for instance. For a very short period of time, they received 1.3 million refugees, of whom 500,000 were from refugee children and youth from South Sudan. This is a country that is already struggling with a low economy. Or Ukraine, who had expected that we would have 3.3 million refugees fleeing and 5.7 million children and youth whose education in Ukraine is at stake today. Who would have expected that in January or December? These are the kind of countries where ECW is designed to function efficiently, because crisis is very different from situations where things are not turned upside down. And I can just give an example. It's not in every country on earth that you have 50 schools, like a place in Kharkiv, that were actually attacked since February, as in Ukraine. And we see attacks against schools, teachers, students in Nigeria, across the Sahel, and in Syria, and many other parts. So we're speaking about abnormal situations where children and youth and their families either stay in the midst of the chaos or move around in the country as internally displaced or cross an international border. So that is why we were created. And that's where the importance of education as a development sector. How do you deliver that in a humanitarian crisis? That is to understand the humanitarian development nexus. Education is development, but how do you deliver development in a humanitarian situation? And there, what Education Cannot Wait was designed to do was to bring the humanitarian actors and the development actors together in the crisis and be designed for crisis. It means Afghanistan, no, you can't work directly with the de facto government. You still have millions of girls who cannot enroll. Hopefully there will be in the coming days. There's been an announcement. But you have 3.7 or 4 million children whose education has been disrupted. So you cannot do the same thing in Afghanistan as you would do in India. You need to have a different approach. And Education Cannot Wait and UNICEF, we had the first women-led mission to Afghanistan in October to put forward girls' secondary education. Hopefully we will see the results of that in the coming days. We're also working very close with the Global Partnership for Education to roll out a coordinated program in Afghanistan. But here we cannot work with the government, and you see the same in Syria and so forth. Now, before I move on, I see the clock is ticking, but so that's why we are also located in the United Nations as a UN Global Fund. Why do I mention that? Because it allows us access. It gives us security and access, relative security, but it enabled us during COVID-19 to travel freely. We took our vaccinations, put our masks on, but we could travel out to the Sahel, to Lebanon, to all these countries. Despite COVID-19, we didn't have travel restrictions, which allowed us to show solidarity with those we serve, with our colleagues on the ground, UNHCR, UNICEF, Save the Children, and others, and local organizations in the midst of COVID-19, rather than working remotely. So it gives us a certain access to go into militia areas, have informal talks with the Taliban, and so forth. That has also made it a very agile global fund. Now, moving on to the response. So when COVID-19 happened, as I mentioned, we decided very early we're going to keep going out there. We have to be there. As we said, when the house is on fire, we are the fire women, the firemen that go into the fire. We don't stay and wait for the fire to come to an end. So that's how we operated COVID-19. We unleashed our entire emergency reserve, and we reached 32 countries and 30 million children during COVID-19. Over to coordination. I have 36 seconds left. You may have to give me another 20 seconds. Because coordination is important, and there are different levels of coordination. And I'm very happy that Save the Children also recognize, and I think everyone does, is that Global Partnership for Education and ECW are working very closely as funds. We are global funds. We are not like UNICEF and UNHCR and Save the Children and Plan International and World Vision. We are not implementers. It's very important because actual implementation is done by them and local organizations. and in countries where the government is more proactive and able, they are obviously always part of that. But in terms of coordination amongst how we develop our joint programs, what ECW has adopted, which has allowed us to move with such speed. We are $1 billion fund today, having investments in 42 crisis countries, is we worked with the United Nations coordination system, meaning when there are no refugees and we have internal displays, we work with the cluster system, and coordinate the NGOs and the UN agencies so that they develop a joint program where humanitarian development actors work together. When you have a refugee situations with the predominantly affected populations of refugees, UNHR is the lead on coordination. Uganda, we have a big education refugee response plan. In many other parts of the world, UNHR coordinates that response. So that's how we operate. These are established coordination mechanisms. We haven't established any parallel mechanism. And then we work with the Partnership for Global Education as two funds so that we can complement one another. In conclusion, I really have to give credit to the host, the European Union. First of all, for both the partnership section of the partnership IDPAD and ECHO for committing to 10%, setting a shining example for the rest of the world to follow. Very important. If everyone could do what the EU has done to put it at 10%, we could move from this 2-3% of allocations to education. Education is, as the minister said, it is the foundation for all sustainable development goals, for recovery, and it's the foundation for all human rights. Explain to me how you can achieve human rights sustainable development goals if the population is illiterate, cannot read and write, they have not addressed the traumas, and they have not been able to go to school. All other human rights sustainable development goals will implode and fall apart without the foundation of education. So I just want to mention that. And also, finally, I'm turning to EU, a great partner of education cannot wait, that really was also the founder of education cannot wait to say, we need you also in the UN multilateral system. You have a strong leadership role to play to increase to 10% for all members of the United Nations. That's 193 member states. We need a value system. We need your response to Ukraine that is so amazing. And we ourselves have invested in education cannot wait. An emergency response will go to Moldova to look at the refugee situation and also invest. But you have acted with such speed on Ukraine. Please also inspire the entire multilateral system in the UN, because we have the same crisis going on in the Sahel, in the Middle East, in Asia. We need that concerted response around the globe, because we have emergencies in every corner of the world today. And we need, as our youth advocate said, we need you now, and we need action, and move from rhetoric to action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and I'm sure your appeal has been heard. I'd like now to turn to Geert Capella, who is the UNICEF representative to the European Union institutions, and he's also the director of the UNICEF Partnership Office. To build on the good practices that we have learned throughout the COVID pandemic, how do you think we can turn them into opportunities for education in emergencies?
Well, thank you so much, Florence. Being one of the last speakers is very difficult, because what I will have to say has been said, in fact. But let me maybe just, before answering to your important question, make a very personal reflection. And reflection about the long way we have come when it comes to education in emergencies. 15 years ago, when we would have had a humanitarian forum like this one, education would not have been on the agenda, or if it would have been an afterthought. 15 years ago, I was UNICEF's representative, serving as UNICEF's representative in Yemen. And when making the case then for including education in our humanitarian response, we were told at that moment, well, first tell us how education is life-saving, and then we will give you humanitarian funding. So we owe it, I think, to thank the organizers of today to have included education in this forum. Thank education cannot wait, and Gordon Brown as a passionate advocate for this. And thanks so very much to the generous donors. Colleagues have already referred to the European Union as an exemplary donor when it comes to education in emergencies. So just an initial personal thought I want to start with. Now, when it comes to the COVID pandemic and how it has affected education, I think for us, when we look and kind of assess the impact, we would say COVID has not necessarily created new problems when it comes to learning and education. COVID has simply exacerbated existing problems education was already suffering from. First of all, deficit in learning. Well, you know, at the end of this month, we will have the second anniversary when WHO declared the global pandemic, COVID as a global pandemic. We will release a report, and the report is looking at the impact upon the learning that the lack of access to schooling has brought during the COVID period. But in fact, we do conclude that, in fact, only more children have a bigger learning deficit than before, where in low and middle income countries before COVID, 50% of 10-year-olds were struggling to read and understand a simple story. That's a huge deficit already. Today, we probably estimate that at over 70%. So the learning deficit has simply increased. School dropout is becoming more and more important. It's not a new problem as a result of COVID. It was there before. But COVID and the lack of access to schools means that it becomes very problematic for a more important number of children to get back to school. So in Uganda, for example, we see 1 out of 10 children who were in school prior to the pandemic do not return to school. So the problem of school dropouts is increasing as a result of COVID. We see also the challenges with inequalities. Also, that has been exacerbated as a result of COVID. The biggest struggle for girls to go to school, the biggest struggle for children with disabilities, the biggest struggle in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Well, that struggle has even become bigger today than it was already before. And last but not least, and I think MacArthur referred to that in her poem and in her initial words. It is the school as a very important place for children to access essential services. When children over the last 2 years struggle to go to school, what we have seen is it has had collateral damage on the nutrition status of children, because thousands, millions of children depend on a good, nutritious meal on school meals. So the fact that children were not able to go to school anymore had an important impact upon their nutritious status. But also in many countries where early marriage is a problem, we saw, as a result of COVID, the number of girls particularly being married at a very early age further increasing. We saw violence increasing, etc. So the impact has been important, but no new problems. The problems that were there before. Now, what do we learn from the COVID response, and what do we need to take as an opportunity for us, as you asked? Well, very important is that investing in education needs to be at the center of the recovery. So simple it is. It needs to be at the center, not only, and as the minister has mentioned, not only for each and every child and and as Inger referred to, their right to education, but also for building back better societies. Investing in education is key. Now, I will end with a point on technology. Very important that digital learning has become much more to the fore as a result of the impact that COVID had on access to school. Very important from what we learned today is that nothing can replace in-person learning. So we need to be clear that digital learning can never be the alternative, the silver bullet. We need to continue investing first and foremost in in-person learning. However, efficient, resilient education systems that are there for every single child accessing quality learning, we need to really rely on technology. That's going to be very important. UNICEF's Reimagine Education is investing in exploring how we can indeed make more technology available. We have the learning passport. Fatima, for example, referred to learning bridges in Jordan, where we have proven evidence that indeed with investment in technology, digital learning becomes a very important additional asset for children, not least in crisis situations. And let me end with Ukraine on two fronts. We are extremely happy as UNICEF that during the COVID crisis, the Ukrainian education authorities have invested in digital platforms. All Ukrainian platform is a digital platform that was made available to have Ukrainian children accessing education. Ukrainian children are blessed to have that platform because now it allows us to work with them, those who are displaced within Ukraine, but also those who are leaving Ukraine, to continue their education in Ukrainian. And final point, and come back to the EU and to what you said, Excellency, 15,000 Ukrainians have already arrived in Portugal, amongst them a very important number of children. The EU has taken an incredible, unprecedented decision with the Temporary Protection Directive. It will allow every single refugee girl and boy to access education. Let me close with a plea. Let us ensure together, all of us here today, that we do not fail the children, that we do not fail the European Union with this incredible decision. Let us make of this temporary protection the new golden standard in how we need to deal with children as refugees, in particular for their education. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Geert. We're now very lucky to have with us, joining us virtually, Samira Nouri. Samira is Education Program Manager in a Citizens Organization for Advocacy and Resilience in Afghanistan, and she's also the former coordinator of Afghan Relief. Samira, good morning and welcome. Samira, Afghanistan is now confronted to great changes related to education. Could you maybe tell us how the international community can keep supporting the education gains of the last years? How can we help?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this platform to talk on behalf of my organization and as well as to share some recent challenges regarding the education and for seeking the support of the development community, that how they can support the education sector in Afghanistan. And I also want to correct that my organization, previously named Coordination of Afghan Relief, and now it's the name is changed to Citizen Organization for Advocacy and Resilience. So regarding your question and the coming to challenges that we are like the education sector in Afghanistan is currently facing. Like before the current sector that is near to collapse. Before that also like different type of factors damage increase in the education sectors like natural disaster, conflict, economic decline, which displaces the people in different parts of the country, and the conflict caused that more than 900 schools closed, damaged, destroyed. And while these schools need to be rehabilitated back to in order to observe the out of school children again. But unfortunately, like the pandemic, as all the respected panelists shared their thoughts and experience regarding.
I'm afraid there are cuts in the sound. Samira, can you hold for a minute if you can hear us? I'm afraid you cannot hear us either. Do we have a way of reaching out to Samira maybe to, yes? Okay, good, thank you. To tell her to hold her presentation as we cannot hear her. We still cannot hear you, Samira, sorry. Can you hear us? Nod if you can. I'm afraid no. No? Can we maybe try to reconnect with Samira while we go on with the other speakers, just to be sure? And I'd like now to turn to our speakers. Remember, I mentioned in the beginning that we had we had a predetermined list of interventions from the floor because we want to give as many people as possible the opportunity to intervene in the discussion. And I'd like to also remind all our speakers from the floor to please stick to your 2 minutes of intervention. Speaking on behalf of the UNHCR and in person with us in the room is Deputy High Commissioner Kelly Clements. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Good morning to everybody here in the room and tuning in remotely. I kind of feel a little bit like I'm on the panel with you because there was so much reference to refugees, displaced, some of the statistics and so on that we have been tracking now for many years. And thank you for all the comments. I want to make 5 quick points. First, the impact of the pandemic, which was just mentioned. Extraordinarily expanding the inequities, the inequalities between those that are most vulnerable, particularly the displaced and refugees, and those that had actually made a few gains in terms of being in school or other education modalities. 80% during these last couple of years, 80% have not had access to in-person and even remote schooling. Second point, the impact on Ukraine, and the minister mentioned this most clearly. We have a real opportunity. We have a real challenge, but we have a real opportunity. If we can get, for example, infrastructure, devices, other policy, digital literacy issues, and so on, rectified, the inclusion piece that you have already in Portugal started to tackle and across the region, this is something that we can take and we can use as a model elsewise. It's a real opportunity, and it really brings home the point on why we need to include refugees into the national systems for their own purposes, as well as social cohesion, social interaction, and so on, as quickly as possible. This moves from a humanitarian immediately to a service delivery piece. Fourth is the issues of including refugees in the design. And we heard this from the testimonies of the 3. And Magartu, who's a 17-year-old Ethiopian refugee in Kenya, she's extraordinary. She wants to be a lawyer. She's already talking about what she needs in terms of that education. We heard that also from Fatima. And each of these incredibly poignant speakers can design their own programs. We don't need to design them for them, and it makes the point that the minister made. And then the last piece, we're heading into the Global Refugee Forum coming up next year. We put a Refugee Connected Challenge in front of the global community. It makes the points of each of the speakers, the panelists, and the refugees we've heard of today. Let's use this moment with every tool possible in terms of connecting and making education possible. I want to echo our UNICEF colleague in terms of how far we've come in 15 years, but the urgency is there to make much more progress, as Gordon Brown has said as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Samira is back. Samira, can you hear us this time? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I should off the camera because due to the weak internet connection, I may not be able to speak well or you can hear me well, so I will off the camera.
Okay, good. Sorry we can't see you, but definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure the time is limited, so I just want to share that how the development donors or international community can sustain the education sector in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, that education system is currently threatened by nearby collapse. Like, it's at a very high risk, and currently we have the funding flow for the education in emergency, but we cannot rely on that funding, or we cannot rely on the community-based education, because the community-based education is provided for the outcomes.
We have lost Samira again, I'm afraid. No? There's a cut. There's a cut in the connection. I'm very sorry about this. We're going to try and reconnect in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to come back to our speakers from the floor. And representing Plan International, we have with us also in the room Serap Altinisi, who's the head office and EU representative. Where's Serap? Yes. Yeah, there should be somebody to give you one, actually. Sorry, it's a DIY sort of informal session.
Thank you very much. Okay, then I stand as well. I think that's good practice for me, isn't it? Okay, perfect. Yes, thanks. And Plan International, as you know, was founded 85 years ago. We had our anniversary 2 days ago. And we were, so to say, founded by an emergency and crisis when the Spanish Civil War was taking place in 1937. And since then, education is one of our pillars and has been. And during those decades, we also became not only a children's rights organization, but also very much focusing on girls and adolescent girls. So we've heard from many of you that, of course, crises and disruptions are particularly impacting disproportionately girls and adolescent girls. What did we hear as well? I can only agree, it's true that, of course, girls and adolescent girls during the pandemic, it was exacerbated. However, it is not only early child marriages, or I would say non-wanted pregnancies, but we love to say early pregnancies, but it's also the fact that sexual exploitation has increased. They are the ones who then have to take care responsibilities. They are also the ones who are having higher impact on their malnutrition, because either they don't get food at all, or they are the last ones to get one. And we know what kind of mental health issues that can, so to say, lead to as well, and how much they have to carry. And we also believe as Plan International, of course, quality, inclusive and safe education is very important. However, we think also it has to be gender transformative. If we want to prevent crisis, emergencies, and we would like to see a peaceful, so to say, society or community, what we need to do is that we have to work with all what we have at hand. That means policies, with teachers. We have to talk about inequalities between boys and girls. We have to look what are the power dynamics. We also have to ensure, for sure, I strongly believe, is also to talk about oppression. And we know that will take a long time, right? Social norms we can't just abolish from one day to the other. However, I think we can all agree, if I look what kind of rights I have now in comparison to my mom and my grandmother, I would say I'm very privileged. But we also know a long way still is, we have still to go a long way. Apart from that, I would say what also is, what we might to look at is, thankfully, yes, European Union has really managed to put 10%, and I think, yes, they should continue and be a role model. 10% is a good start. And also what I would like to conclude with is, because I see I've got how many seconds left? 52? Is that, as Anujuti said from Sri Lanka, right? It's not only acting in emergencies, it's also if we really ensure that we have a gender transformative education across the globe, we will ensure that we have a peaceful society and communities. I'm convinced, and I think when we achieve this, girls, boys all together will have the opportunity to learn, lead, decide, and thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next intervention is from the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, and we have the pleasure of welcoming virtually Nevena Valentinova-Saikova. Nevena?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join this event, of course, amongst such a distinguished panelists, and it was also great to hear from young people about the importance of education. Unfortunately, in conflict settings around the world, children's access to education is profoundly undermined by attacks on education and the military use of schools. And the impact of these attacks is devastating for all students, but boys and girls often face different risks and may require different responses. For example, girls may be more at risk of sexual violence, while boys might be more vulnerable to child recruitment. The Safe Schools Declaration is a voluntary political commitment launched in 2015 to safeguard education during wartime and better protect girls and boys from the negative consequences of these attacks. And to date, we have 114 countries that have joined the declaration. And given the limited time, I just want to share and focus on a few recommendations to states, humanitarian and education actors in order to better protect education during conflict. First, all states should endorse and implement the declaration in a gender-responsive way, including its guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. Also should provide non-discriminatory and gender-responsive legal, medical, psychosocial assistance to survivors of attacks, including sexual and reproductive health services, and engage in outreach to ensure that survivors have access to them. Should also provide alternative delivery of education to ensure continuity in access to learning opportunities, which provide structure, routine, and support students and teachers' psychosocial well-being. Also should develop a systematic and comprehensive school-based safety and security plan, and implement early warning and alert systems, and more often carry out a risk analysis before developing and implementing these school-based measures. And also I would like to end with the words of Shiela, a girl whose school was attacked during violence in the Kasai region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. She said, "I love school a lot because through my studies, I will be able to have a better future. I will be able to support my family and look after myself. I want to be a doctor." As we discussed today, education ensures that no generation is lost, and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration can be transformative in achieving this goal. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Our next intervention is from Humanity and Inclusion, and we have joining us remotely as well, Margaret Nguhi. Margaret is the Country Director for Kenya. Margaret? Hello? Margaret, yes? Hello, good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning. How are you from Nairobi, Kenya?
Well, it's sunny in Brussels for once, so, you know.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and to have listened to all the presentations, and I bring you our practical experience from Kenya, especially in the refugee camps. And I'd like to say that humanity and inclusion has always been an advocate of the use of ICT to support the learning of children with disabilities. We published a study and ICT fact sheet last year and gathered best practices during the COVID pandemic. For instance, in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, we partnered with ICT experts Ikitabu and provided a range of regular and specialized ICT support. We fitted tablets with packages of accessible digital content for Kenya's curriculum, textbooks, supplementary materials, and interactive content which is fully offline and accessible through Ikitabu app. Other activities involved training upper primary and secondary learners on how to use the digital platforms and participate in interactive forums. All this is done in collaboration with relevant government authorities to ensure sustainability and to support the nexus by offering content developed in emergencies to all Kenyan stakeholders. Some recommendations. To the local governments, we'd like to recommend that they integrate ICT into their education sector plans and set aside specific budgets for its implementation. And also ensure that the Ministry of Education is systematically empowered to lead collaborations and facilitate multi-stakeholder platforms. And to the donor community, we'd like to beg you, please give priority to inclusive education in the aid programming, particularly in response to the pandemic that had catastrophic impacts on access to education for children with disabilities. Please increase the funding to support the transformation towards inclusive, quality education systems that maximize the potential of ICT tools to facilitate the inclusion of children with disabilities and the marginalized learners. In conclusion, I'd like to sincerely thank PG ECHO for having prioritized disability and inclusive education, especially in Kenya in the refugee camps, and the other donors that are supporting HI in reaching the most vulnerable children, and for organizing this important sharing forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We now will be hearing from Spark, and we have with us here in the room Yannick Dupont, who is the CEO.
Thank you. Let me first congratulate the ECHO team for a wonderful discussion this morning. I would like to make 3 recommendations that I'll build on a partnership that we've been running with the EU, with the Madat program around the Syria conflict, but it would apply to most of our work. One relates to the nexus and linking education to early recovery and to development. The second point is on localization, to build better adjusted programs in the local context, but also for cost effectiveness. And the final one that I hear a lot also here on the panel is on partnerships and how to make sure we have more impact because financial means are limited. And I'll link that again to cultural sensitivity. I'll leave it open for now what it is. First, as Spark, we work in fragile and conflict-affected states around the world to get youth into education and jobs. And we see the connection very much between the two. So also in the light of the nexus, I think we need to start programming backwards. So we need to see, okay, what will the country need to reconstruct? Where will the jobs be? So green jobs probably in the future, digital jobs. Not the jobs of today, but the job of the future when these children will get out of school and out of university, hopefully. Second, localization. So there's a lot of talk about localization. I was there at the World Humanitarian Summit and Grand Bargain. It's all beautiful. But where are the targets on localization? Where do we say 20% more by 2025, 50% more by 2030? Also for us, the NGOs, because we're middlemen. So we should cancel ourselves out, right? That was the idea from the beginning. So where are the targets? in building local capacity and creating more cost effectiveness in implementation, knowing that the means are limited. So we can call for more money, or we can do it more cost effectively. And that's, I think, also through more localization. And localization also actually brings a lot of effectiveness in the Madad program, where we approached local governments and universities and schools in a partnership that led to sometimes 8 times more cost-effective placements, because the government started to co-invest. They saw it as helping them, not as an outside donation. So I think these partnerships and localization are very important. Then finally, on partnerships with the EU Madad Fund, and it was actually the former trust fund manager Karkutli of the Madad Fund who brokered it for us. Every euro that we raise in the West, we can match by factor 1 or factor 2 in the Arabic Gulf. So at the moment we work with 8 partners in 4 JCC states, and it's actually quite amazing in 2 ways. One, you can really leverage and get more cost effectiveness, but secondly, and coming back to the appliedness of our interventions, working with, for example, the Islamic Development Bank in Islamic countries, and 3/4 of these fragile states are a member of that bank, we have learned so much more about how do we attain, for example, gender inclusiveness in a country like Afghanistan or Yemen. And that's sometimes not through Western lens, but in a very different local context. So to sum again up, I think we've learned over the years that we really need to work our way back from development, early recovery, into education to plan ahead. What do we fund in education? What do we fund for? Maybe not art history, but maybe engineering, building bridges. Secondly, that really a lot of efficiency, but also cultural sensitivity in programming will arise if we take localization to the next level, put targets, and really start doing it. Also questioning how quick as INGOs we can hand over, speaking just for the INGOs. And thirdly, I think we can do a lot of more smarter partnerships with these national governments, but also with innovative other new donors, like from the Arabic Gulf, which is not just financial, but very much more also in how you conceptualize programs, get access to certain areas. Like the UN point was made, and we have seen experience with some of their donors that unlock very difficult to reach areas for us. So thank you very much for today, and looking forward to the rest.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have a message from Samira, because unfortunately it is impossible to reconnect with her. So on her behalf, I'd like to make an appeal to not leave behind Afghan children. They are in need of support, of development donor support, because they need to receive long-term educational programs. They need to benefit from long-term educational programs. The Afghan education system is at very high risk for the moment and near collapse. So remember, they are in real need of support. That is the message we have received from Samira. I'd like now to invite the representative of War Child, Annelies Claessens, who's the Director for International Programs, to deliver her intervention.
Thank you very much. So War Child is an organization that was established about 25 years ago, responding to crises, and we're very much focused on mental health, psychosocial support, education and child protection, and particularly also the link between these sectors. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about one of our programs in education technology, some of the lessons learned on COVID-19 and some recommendations, and I'll keep it very short. I'll try. So on Can't Wait to Learn, which is our program, it is a self-paced education technology intervention on tablets, and it is adapted to the national curriculum. And it can be used both in formal school and out-of-school settings, and be adapted to multiple contexts. So that's why it can be scaled, like Minister Silva also mentioned the importance of being able to scale. And actually now we have been able to adapt the program for remote delivery because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of our lessons learned, 3 points I'd like to make. The importance of already having different implementation modalities. Because we had different implementation modalities before the COVID pandemic hit, we already were able to use in classroom settings, but we also had the ability to be out of school. And in that way, we could adapt easily also for this particular pandemic. So for now, for the pandemic, we actually were able to adapt even more and make sure that we had like a downloadable link in Lebanon, because the penetration there of devices made that possible. But in Uganda, this was not possible. So we actually used our same modality, which was a tablet, but making sure that we actually went from house to house, bringing the tablet there, making sure it was clean, and adapting in that way. So adaptability, I think, is something that is a lesson learned in making sure that these programs can continue. Another point which also speaks to the Minister Silva's point on networking. The prior engagement, making sure that we already had all these engagements with actors on the ground, made it possible for us to go very fast in adapting our programming to the COVID pandemic. And thirdly, we actually were able to develop a new tool, which is called Gobi. And this tool this actually measures the learning outcomes. And it's an app that can be used by anyone. So because for us it's very important not only reach children, but be very sure that they actually learn. And that's what we can now use this measurement tool for. And actually, it can also measure psychosocial, social and emotional learning in this app. So it's hoping something that we can scale again, because that's one of our approaches, to be able to scale and share this technology with others and not keep it to ourselves. So maybe in terms of recommendations, under these circumstances, I think it's very important that the flexibility of donors are there. We were able to actually make these adaptations with our own money, and then luckily afterwards we get some of this reimbursed by some of the foundations. I think the other point is for also very practical recommendations for some of the donors in the room, to make sure that if you have applications for your funding, that you give appropriate timelines for us to be able to actually respond and have a quality proposal be sent in. And lastly, the rechanneling of aid to Ukraine. We know there are these pre-existing needs already, so we should be all coming together, making sure that we have more aid available and not rechanneling aid to Ukraine, even though we all know the needs are there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last intervention will be in French, so we will give some work to our English interpreters. Donc je vais passer en français pour présenter cette session, pour vous donner le temps de mettre vos écouteurs si c'est nécessaire. Et nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir avec nous Mr. Mayedine Keladi du Secours islamique de France. Bonjour monsieur.
Bonjour madame. I apologize, I will speak in French. Sorry. Merci de me donner cette possibilité de vous donner un exemple. Le Secours islamique de France, ça fait 30 ans qu'il agit dans le domaine de l'humanitaire, plus particulièrement dans le domaine de l'éducation et la protection des enfants, notamment en situation de crise. Et je voulais ici citer un exemple, de partir d'un exemple concret en Syrie, avec notre partenaire UNICEF. On a mis en place des classes virtuelles, avant les classes virtuelles, donc des classes pour les enfants dans une éducation non formelle, dans les centres communautaires, que ce soit les centres où vous habitez ou les écoles, mais en dehors des heures de permanence. Et on a pu, à ce moment-là, faire venir des enfants après quelques années de décrochage scolaire. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'avec cette partie éducation, nous avons ajouté une partie protection et un accompagnement psychosocial. Et cette partie-là était très importante, notamment avec tous les acteurs communautaires, les parents, les familles, environnant donc les enfants. Et on a constaté au moment du Covid, justement, quand il y a eu le Covid, on a pu mettre en place très rapidement des classes virtuelles via WhatsApp et autres, pour pouvoir justement lutter et pour éviter que les enfants décrochent à nouveau. Et c'était important pour nous dans cette partie-là. Ce qui peut-être, à travers cet exemple-là, je voulais peut-être attirer votre attention sur trois choses et faire un appel sur trois choses. Donc, l'éducation non formelle en période de crise n'est pas à négliger. Ce n'est pas la solution idéale, mais c'est quelque chose de très important pour lutter contre le décrochage scolaire, justement. Le deuxième sujet, c'est d'intégrer le volet protection à l'éducation, notamment le volet psychosocial. Et le troisième, c'est de prendre l'environnement global de l'enfant, donc les acteurs sociaux, les acteurs communautaires, les familles, dans l'approche. Et à ce moment-là, j'ai donné l'exemple des classes virtuelles sur WhatsApp. Et je pense que c'est fondamental. Je pense en tant qu'ONG, en tant que bailleur, en tant qu'acteur communautaire, au cœur de notre préoccupation, c'est l'enfant et son bien-être. Et je pense qu'il faut qu'on se mette d'accord sur ça. Et à ce moment-là, je pense qu'on pourra arriver à ce que les panélistes ont développé tout à l'heure dans leur approche. Et merci.
Merci à vous. Merci beaucoup. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this session. Thank you very, very much to all our panelists for being with us this morning and for all of those who joined us online. The discussion that was started here this morning will continue in the run-up to the UN Transforming Education Summit next September. So stay tuned, because there's definitely much more to be done between now and then. And I would like, as a practical detail, to invite you to go upstairs to the large lobby for the coffee break rather than stay here to the smaller distribution points, because things will go much faster so that you can all be more or less on time for the next sessions. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the event.